Good morning, everybody. This is another edition of the Passball Show, brought to you by JohnPielli.com, by St. Aloysius Church in Jackson, New Jersey, by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck, located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. As always, handful of stuff we're going to get into today in the world of baseball, sports, and unifying America. I'm setting this video up on YouTube to launch as a premiere, so if there's anything that's on your mind that you want to bring up, just comment. I will address it either in the comment feed or on the next program. Today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about baseball, and as I promised on my Thursday show, we're going to do a pretty in-depth fantasy baseball preview. So I do think this show is going to have some value. A lot of people are in fantasy sports, and a lot of you are successful. A lot of you go out there and win championships year in and year out. Some of you win championships every once in a while. What we understand about fantasy sports is that there is a little bit of a luck element involved. You have to have the players that you draft stay healthy, assuming that you're taking what is probably considered the best player at the best position and the best time of the draft. Because you figure the majority of the people in your league are on the same level as you. There's some people that traditionally underachieve, traditionally don't draft good teams, and traditionally don't have good results. But for the majority of you that do, sometimes it is the way the ball bounces sometimes. A player that you draft so high in a draft, did they get hurt one year when they were healthy every other year? Did you take a player that has been so good for so long, and then all of a sudden, that one year that he's on your team, he doesn't do any good? We could all relate to that. So I'll talk about that. I got a top 20 as far as the top 20 players that I would draft in this particular order. And then I got a do's and don'ts when it comes to the prospects. I've studied a good amount of the top 100 prospects in all of baseball. Some of them you may want to take as sleepers. Some of them you may want to stay away from. Some of them you might want to take way before you get into the sleeper round. But there's a couple baseball points going back to history and thinking about things that have happened before. And if you remember, if you're as a Mets fan, you remember one of the worst trades that they've made in history, one of the trades that blew up their face instantly the second it was consummated. Within a year of watching this player play for the next team that he went to, you realized it was a mistake, and that was when they traded Nolan Ryan to the California Angels for Jim Furgosi. Now, Ryan was part of a package. Furgosi was actually the sought-after player in this deal. And the Mets had a problem. They couldn't fill third base. Even after winning the World Series in 1969, they didn't have a ton of belief in Wayne Garrett. And they tried, whether it was Joe Foy or anybody else that could put there. They just couldn't get a regular performing offensive and defensive third baseman. And what they did is they made a trade with the Angels for an all-star shortstop. A player that was one of the better players in the American League, and in fact, in the short history of the California Angels franchise, was one of the better known players to play for that team, and that was Jim Furgosi. The thought was, with Buddy Harrelson at shortstop, you can move Furgosi, who was a good defensive good defensive shortstop, over to third base, where he'll probably hit a little bit, and maybe man the keystone for the better part of the next decade. That didn't work out. So one of the main reasons that the Nolan Ryan Jim Furgosi trade didn't work out is that Jim Furgosi didn't perform as advertised. And that's one of the things that seldom gets looked at. You say, oh man, imagine a New York Mets rotation in the early 70s of Tom Seaver, Jerry Koosman, and Nolan Ryan. But there were reasons that Nolan Ryan was not as thought of within his own team. None of it was personal. None of it was because of a lack of talent. It was, if you compare Nolan Ryan in 1971 and 1970 to Tom Seaver of that time, you weren't talking about equals. You weren't talking about pitchers that were on the same level. Tom Seaver had become one of the best, if not the best pitcher in all of Major League Baseball, would go out there and give you a 9 just about every time he took the ball, was the workhorse, was the ace. Nolan Ryan did not get a lot of opportunity because he struggled with his control. And that was one of the things that kind of held him back in his time with the Mets. And it doesn't get brought up that much. Because, like I said, hindsight is always 20/20. When you're looking at a player that's on a particular team, and you wonder, hey, if you just held on to him, would he have been just as good? And I don't know if Gil Hodges and Rube Walker valued Nolan Ryan as good or as much as he should have been. Now, like I said, you go back in history and you say, what if the Mets moved Nolan Ryan into their rotation, let's say regularly in 1970. Let's say 1969, he helps him out, he helps him win a World Series, the big three-inning relief appearance to finish the game that he did. Well, it was a huge performance. It certainly led to that team being in the best position to win a World Series. That was a great team. There was no one individual that carried that New York Mets franchise. Nolan Ryan's role that he had on the 1969 team was very much valued. But let's say they popped him into the rotation in 1970, and you imagine a starting rotation of Tom Seaver, Jerry Koosman, and Nolan Ryan. Well, Nolan Ryan's walk rate was still higher than it should have been. In 1970, he walked 6.6 batters per 9 innings, which, even if you're able to keep the hits down, it's something that is not conducive for success over a long period of time. There's going to be a lot of runs given up. And you look at his performance in 1971, 6.9 walks per 9 innings, which, by the way, from 1972 on through the rest of his career, he never approached those numbers in regards to walks per 9 innings pitched again. Now, the reason I bring this up is because, once again, we could live in what happened and what his career was about and just assume that if he stayed with the Mets, he would have been just as good. Did the Angels, after they acquired him in 1972, did they do a better job of curtailing his control? Did Nolan Ryan all of a sudden overnight be able to keep the ball in the strike zone enough to reduce the amount of walks that he had per 9 innings? Now, the one counter, which ends up helping Nolan Ryan out a lot, is the more innings he pitches, the less hits he gives up. And we know about Nolan Ryan's 7 no-hitters. That's a record that, by the way, never gets spoken about when it comes to records in baseball that will never be broken. Nobody's ever going to throw 7 no-hitters again. But Nolan Ryan was able to keep batters off the bases, not necessarily through lack of walks, but not giving up hits. And starting in 1972, which was the first year that he led the league in least amount of hits per 9 innings, 10 times over the course of his career does Nolan Ryan have the lowest hits per 9 innings pitched total in the league. You know, the average, 5.3 in 1972. And that's a big deal. Because if you're walking 5 batters per 9 innings pitched, which he was able to reduce his rate by almost 2 walks per 9 innings, 5 is still a little high. But if you're walking 5 guys and giving up 5 hits per 9 innings pitched, that means that's 10 base runners, assuming that there's limited amount of hits hit by pitches. And you're talking about a guy that if he is pitching a complete game, he's given up 10 base runners per 9 innings. And yes, 5 walks is a lot, but 5 walks is assuming you're giving up 10 hits as well. Most pitchers give up around a hit per inning, or a little less than a hit per inning. Maybe 7 or 8 hits per 9 innings pitched. Nolan Ryan was able to keep that down to 5. Now, did the Mets do a bad job scouting Nolan Ryan? I don't know. I know they had a lot of really good pitching, and it was beyond just Seaver and Koosman. Tug McGraw, Gary Gentry, eventually John Matlack. You know, they keep bringing in very good young arms. Part of it, I think, is a good system that they have in the minor leagues to get these guys ready. And part of it was the lack of success that the Mets had for the better part of the 1960s. You're bad for that long, especially when MLB has full-blown instituted a draft. 2 drafts going on per year. It's constant reward for mediocrity and not being very good. So you get the best selection of the players. And the Mets did a very good job of developing pitching. And in fact, you look at the history of the franchise, it's one thing that they've done well. Whether you're talking about the 60s or the early 70s or the 80s. Obviously, the first decade of the 21st century. Starting in 2008, 2009, obviously into the second decade, where you develop guys like Jacob deGrom and Zach Wheeler and Noah Syndergaard. Some guys that helped you from coming from other franchises. But to just assume that Nolan Ryan was going to just jump into the Mets rotation and be just as good as he ended up being for the better part of the, 22 seasons that he didn't pitch for the franchise? That's not fair to say. Thinking about the Peter Seitz decision of 1975, which led to free agency, basically ended the reserve clause in Major League Baseball. Obviously, it was a turning point. Players were getting treated not fairly. You understood the old-time stories about Hall of Famers like Stan Musial, who had to go out there and have a second job in the off-season. He worked at a hardware store, or this person worked at a bank, or this person worked in the lumber yard. All different types of jobs that they had in the off-season just to make ends meet. Because the average salary of a Major League Baseball player, even the best, was not enough to feed a family of 4 or 5. And we know families at that time were a little bit larger than they are now. So you're talking about an average of 3 to 4 or maybe 5 kids that each family was having in the 1940s and 50s and 60s up through the 70s. And you look at the fact that the average income for a star baseball player was not very high. So the Peter Seitz decision of 1975 was really the second stage, or actually the turning point in what became full-blown free agency. But the first example of free agency happened a couple of years earlier when Catfish Hunter had his contract voided by the Oakland Athletics and was awarded free agency. Now, part of Catfish Hunter being awarded free agency was the fact that the owner of the Philadelphia Athletics, Charles Finley, was not liked by Commissioner Bowie Kuhn. And this was something that the commissioner would invoke several times, the clause of putting himself in there to say, hey, this is the best, in the best interest of the game of baseball to do it this way. This is why we have to change this. And he did it about 4 or 5 different times for Charles Finley, mostly about Finley after the invoke of free agency, trying to sell off his players because he didn't want to lose them. He wanted to get money for them because he knew he couldn't pay them over a long period of time. But off of Charles Finley for a second, because one of the more underrated things in baseball history was that the Yankees, quote unquote, stole Catfish Hunter from the Athletics, and he was a major reason that the Yankees won the World Series in 1977 and 1978. The unfortunate thing, and I'm going to make another example to back up this point, Catfish Hunter was not a great Yankee. He was not an all-time Yankee. You see his number 27 out in Monument Park over by the plaques. His number's retired. He's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. When you talk about Catfish Hunter and his accomplishments, you talk about the 2 World Series championships he won with the New York Yankees in 1977 and 1978, and the AL pennant in 1976. Coming off 3 straight World Series championships in 1972, 73, and 74 as the star pitcher for the Oakland Athletics. And it's just assumed, once again, hindsight, going back in, history goes by. Catfish Hunter, a great athletic, is assumed that he was a great Yankee, and I hate to break it to you, he really wasn't. He was not a great Yankee. He was a good Yankee. In fact, his best season was 1975 when the Yankees did not make the playoffs. Won over 20 games that year, pitched a career-high 328 innings. Might have been one of his best seasons. As good as his Cy Young season in 1974, which was his last year in Oakland. Finished second in the Cy Young Award that year. 76, he wasn't as good, but was very important. He was the number 1 pitcher on the New York Yankees pitching staff when it came to the 1976 team that, unfortunately, will be remembered for getting swept by the Cincinnati Reds in a World Series that year. Doesn't mean it wasn't a great team, But you could say within reason that Catfish Hunter was still the best pitcher on that staff in 1976. Now, this is his second year. He signed a 5-year deal as a contract with the New York Yankees, the first major free agent to be available to be signed. But the Yankees that year in 76, they needed Ed Figueroa just as much. It's very easy to underestimate the season Doc Ellis had that year. Kenny Holtzman, his old buddy from Oakland, was very important that year too. And of course, the bullpen led by Sparky Lyle and Dick Tidrow to kind of help finish games. Grant Jackson was solid. He had come over from the Baltimore Orioles that year. But you look at Catfish Hunter's 76 season, and it's a little underwhelming. Not great, not bad. He was still the number one pitcher on the team that year. Going to 77, which is year 3. Once again, year 3 of the 5-year contract. So we're looking at Catfish Hunter. Was it a good signing for the Yankees? I think it was a reason that they got out of mediocrity and became a force again in the American League. And remember the problem with the Yankees. 1964 was their last World Series appearance. Some people had said that the Yankees had been to the World Series and won enough World Series, and if they never won another one, it would be okay, it would be fair to allow the other teams to catch up. Well, the other teams were catching up. It was 1976, and the Yankees hadn't been in a World Series in 12 years. Once again, 77 comes. Catfish Hunter has an extremely down season. 4.71 ERA, the highest he had ever had in a full season. He only makes 22 starts that year. Ed Figueroa, Mike Torres, the emergence of Ron Guidry, Don Gullett. And we talk about pitchers from the 70s that, man, if he could have stayed healthy, how good could Don Gullett have been had he been pitching through the 80s? He might have been one of the best left-hand pitchers in the game. His stuff was that good. But Catfish Hunter on that team was an afterthought. The Yankees won the World Series. Catfish Hunter pitched in the World Series. But this wasn't a starting pitching staff led by Catfish Hunter. And like you said, we're only talking about year 3 of the deal. So we go to 1978, a year later, and from a win-loss standpoint, Catfish Hunter at 12-6. If I'm not mistaken, I think he had 10 complete games that year. And I'm saying that because I don't have the numbers right in front of me. 5 complete games. So he made 20 starts. He was 12-6, 5 complete games. The amount of innings that he threw started to add up on him. And then he has the season. Of course, the Yankees win the World Series in 78. The season in 79, where his ERA is up in the high 5s. That's the last year of his contract. He ends up retiring after that year. Now, it's easy to say one of the turning points of the Yankees turning around their franchise was the signing of Catfish Hunter. I think there's a lot that has been said about Reggie Jackson and his impact on that team. None of which would be disputed. Having Reggie Jackson on that team had a lot more to say in the Yankees winning World Series in 77 and 78 than Catfish Hunter. So the point is, the long-winded point as usual, is the amount of emphasis that was put in the signing of Catfish Hunter and how significant it was for baseball. The fact that Catfish Hunter got out of his contract with the Oakland Athletics, was a free agent, and the Yankees signed him to a 5-year deal, there's a lot that's overrated there. It had a great impact on the sport, but was not a very good signing. It was not up there with, let's say, go back 20, 30 years later, the signing of CC Sabathia. CC Sabathia was worth his contract and more. Max Scherzer, as he enters the 7th year of his contract this year, was worth it plus, as much as it possibly could be. Both of those pitchers led their teams to World Series championships. Catfish Hunter, though he's got 5 of them, did not lead the Yankees to a World Series championship in any one of them. And the other one I want to talk about is Andy Messersmith, because Andy Messersmith was symbolic of what it meant to go from the reserve clause into free agency. It was his decision and Dave McNally's decision to play the 1975 season without a contract. The way the rules were set is each team and their ownership had the ability to renew a player's contract for the following season with an option for the next season. That's how the contracts were handled. There was no long-term contract. It was set. Here's your salary for next year, and we have an option to bring you back next year if we want. Now, the way out of it was what Marvin Miller thought of, and Messersmith and Dave McNally were the examples, to play a full season without a contract, which would have been that option here, and leave it up to an arbiter to determine whether they qualify for free agency. Because they played a season for nothing. So they played a season without a contract, which was technically their option season, and it was up to Peter Seitz in December of 1975 as the arbiter to come up with a decision. And he ruled in favor of the players. And for the second time, and the first since Catfish Hunter, players were granted free agency. Andy Messersmith, at the time, was pitching for the Dodgers, came off his best season. Dave McNally was pitching for the Montreal Expos. He was injured. Free agency didn't really impact him, but he was used to help Marvin Miller and the Players Association in their argument. So, to talk about Messersmith for a second, he signs a 4-year deal with the Atlanta Braves to be their top pitcher. There's a lot of expectations for the Braves in the late 70s. Remember who their manager was. A lot of people forget. Bobby Cox was the manager of the Braves, the Hall of Fame manager, the guy that we think of the great run in the 90s and a 14 straight division championships. The, 5 times in a World Series? And then 1 World Series championship? Bobby Cox was managing the Braves in the late 70s, and there was a lot of expectations out of those teams. As adding Messersmith as a top starter was supposed to propel that team to the next level, and it ended up not doing so. Messersmith, after the second year, had his contract sold to the New York Yankees. So this big deal, and once again, it's symbolic because Messersmith and McNally's granting of free agency in the Seitz decision changed baseball, got rid of the reserve clause, and led to free agency, which players for generations and generations can look back and be thankful and grateful to those players for what they did. But the Andy Messersmith contract with the Braves was not any good. It wasn't. He gave you 1 good year, was bad the second year, had his contract sold to the Yankees for year 3, didn't pitch well for them. The Yankees released him after year 3. And it was a free agent again, already getting paid. What would have been the 4th year of his deal with the Braves. Signs back with the Dodgers, makes it through August, gets released, and his career is over. So once again, that's the point. We look back at 2 of the most impactful players when it came to free agency, didn't necessarily sign good contracts. So I promise this show will be a little bit of a fantasy baseball preview. And once again, this is the Pass Ball Show brought to you by JohnPielli.com, by St. Aloysius Church in Jackson, New Jersey, by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So a couple points I want to talk about fantasy baseball. You think of the way the game has changed. Starting pitchers, if they go 5 innings, if they go 6 innings, are considered to have done their job. You got bullpen games, you got openers. You got the game of baseball that has changed from a starting pitching standpoint very much from those that remember the old mail-in leagues from the 1990s and earlier. In fact, if you go back 10 years in fantasy baseball, you talk about how the rules have probably changed. And I think the most important thing I could suggest to you, if you want advice when it comes to fantasy baseball, is to go over and study the point value of all the different stats. See how much a win is valued at. Because you may not believe in a win when it comes to sabermetrics, when it comes to your knowledge of baseball. But what pitchers are going to end up getting the most wins? Is it that star middle reliever? Is it that secondary starter that just goes 5 innings on a team that's going to score a lot of runs? And the main point I'm going to make when it comes to this is there's a lot of overvalue when it comes to starting pitchers. You go to anybody's list of the top 10, top 20, top 30 players that should be drafted in any fantasy baseball league, There's going to be way too many starting pitchers. And I hate to say it, when you go from the top 5 or the top 6 or the top 7, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I don't know if I'm really willing to waste a top pick on the 6th or 7th best starting pitcher in baseball, because I think there's going to be a lot of pitchers that are going to be on that same level that you could get in later rounds. So I would be more offensive needed happy when it comes to loading up my team, especially how many roster spots I got. You got a corner infielder, you got a middle infielder, you got 2 utilities, you got a DH, whatever you end up having. Those extra position values are going to be a lot. I would rather have them filled with quality players that are going to produce top numbers than risk it with a pitcher that may only go 5 innings, may not get a lot of wins because he's not going long enough in a game even if he pitches well. What's the value on walks and hits per innings pitched? What's the value on ERA? What's the value on strikeouts per 9 innings pitched? How much are you getting per strikeout? You may want to have a couple more closers. What's the value of saves? Do you have a point allowance for what a hold would be? Or a scoreless inning? Those are all different things. You might want to study the bylaws and point values of your particular league. But a couple things I'm going to go over. And like I said, any way you want to comment, just throw it on the premiere stream here on YouTube. And I will either comment back or I'll mention it in my next program. So I got a top 20 when it comes to the players that I would draft. And if I had every one of these picks, and of course the players that I picked before would assume that they were off the board. So unless I name the player, that means that player is still on the board. So the first player I would still take is Mike Trout. Mike Trout is still the best player in baseball. I think, barring any sort of injury fear, which we haven't seen yet, he's certainly the safest player to take. And you know what his numbers in the past have been. When Mike Trout's at his best, he is amongst the highest in regards to fantasy baseball points in the entire sport. The other guy who's creeping up is Juan Soto. Juan Soto gets a high on-base percentage. He is very slowly becoming one of the best players in baseball. And I'd take him number 2. And I'm buying Fernando Tatis. He plays a premium position at shortstop. I think over the course of a full season, if he's healthy, he's going to hit 40-plus home runs. He's got a high on-base percentage. He's got a ton of energy. He's going to be a legitimate MVP candidate. And how about Mookie Betts, 2-time World Series champion, the MVP? If I have the number 4th pick and Trout, Soto, and Tatis are off the board, I'm taking Betts with the number 4 pick. And I'm taking all 4 of those players over any pitcher. Now it gets to a point where you say, how far do you go before you can't pass up the best pitcher in baseball? And that, of course, is Jacob deGrom. And I snag him with the number 5 pick. Now, if you want to take deGrom 1, 2, 3, or 4 and want to just have the best pitcher in baseball, I totally understand that. But I do think the value of Trout, Soto, Tatis, and Betts are higher than that of taking Jacob deGrom. I'd rather have one of those 4 players than Jake, but I understand if you're worried about having enough starting pitching, which I think is one of the bigger fears that we run into in fantasy baseball, and I don't think it's necessarily true. I think you need to have more and stronger starting pitching than you really have. But when you total up the point values of the players that you have that go out there and hit and are playing just about every single game, you're giving up a lot of points for a guy that might make 1 start a week. deGrom is that good, so I got him at 5. Ronald Acuna, I go with number 6. Another transcending type of player. He's going to steal 30 home runs. Hit 30 home runs, steal 30 bases. He's going to hit 300. I like him if I'm going to build my team around him. And I take Garrett Cole, number 7, as my second starting pitcher. Somebody may say, hey, deGrom coming off the board. Yeah, Cole is probably your second best choice if you're not named Jacob deGrom. Then I got Freddie Freeman, Christian Yelich, and Francisco Lindor Once again, assuming that all these teams are picking their first player. Then I go Shane Bieber, Trey Turner, Cody Bellinger, Lucas Giolito, Jose Ramirez. That's 11 through 15. Alex Bregman, Trevor Story, Rafael Devers, Walker Buehler, Nolan Arenado, 16 through 20. Now, you might be down on Arenado, and maybe you could get Arenado a little bit later if you want to risk. But I hate to watch 19 players be selected and Nolan Arenado still be on the board at number 20 without somebody snagging him. He's had obviously a higher value over the years, and you know that his numbers in Coors Field playing for the Rockies were a little more inflated. He goes to the Cardinals, maybe a little more of a pitcher-friendly ballpark. How much is he going to decline? I think he's motivated. He's motivated to go out there and prove that the greatness of the player, the dominance of the player, the reason he's been so good was not just because he played in Colorado and his home games in Coors Field. And he's playing for a good team. Cardinals are expected to win that division. Him and Paul Goldschmidt should provide one of the best 3 or 4s or 2 and 3s in all of Major League Baseball. I would have a hard time passing on Nolan Arenado at number 20. Number 19, taking Walker Buehler. I don't think that's a stretch either. Bieber, Giolito, Buehler. And I take Buehler over Max Scherzer, Aaron Nola, Trevor Bauer, Yu Darvish, Blake Snell, Brandon Woodruff, Clayton Kershaw. A lot of really good pitchers, but I'd rather have Buehler and his youth and the fact that I could see him pitching more innings than any Dodger pitcher this year. There's him, there's Bauer, there's Kershaw. And I think you look at that team, which is going to be expected to go out there and win the World Series again. Listen, don't make the foolish mistake of taking Bauer. Listen, I think Bauer's going to have a good year. But I think Buehler is set to probably win a Cy Young this year. So I mentioned some pitchers. Once again, Scherzer, Nola, Bauer, Darvish, Snell, Woodruff, Kershaw. Is there anybody that hits my mind off the top of my head as a sleeper? You think of Jack Flaherty. If the Cardinals are for real this year, I think he'll have a solid bounce back. You could get him 3rd, 4th, 5th round, something like that. I think it'd be a good investment. Luis Castillo. You think of the Reds kind of being down, but I think that the Pirates are going to be so bad in that division. And you look at the fact that a lot of those teams are on the same level. The Reds, the Cubs, the Brewers, they're going to be beating each other up a lot this year. I think the Reds can win a little more games than expected. Castillo can go out there and be the ace of that staff. No Bauer, maybe it's Luis Castillo's time. And then I think of some position players that missed out on this top 20. If you have a chance after pick 20 and Bryce Harper's still available, you better pick him up. I'd wait a little bit on Manny Machado. I'd take Anthony Rendon. I'd take Corey Seager. I'd take even Gleyber Torres before I took Manny Machado. But you get to a certain point where you're like, how far are you going to let Manny Machado be available before I scoop him up myself? You're talking, late 2nd, 3rd round. You start to think about that. Carlos Correa is going to be a free agent at the end of the year. So is Michael Conforto. I think those are 2 players that you could expect to have really good walk years. And then there's always the question about Aaron Judge. Aaron Judge had that breakout rookie year where he hit the 52 home runs and was thought to be a legitimate MVP candidate in the American League. He hasn't been healthy since. And you'll wonder, are you wasting a pick if you go in a 2nd round and you take an Aaron Judge? You know what he could be if he's healthy. That's the only question. And the other guy they got in the Yankee outfield, Giancarlo Stanton, he may be DHing, he may be playing left field, whatever. It's hard to imagine those players being healthy and not putting up, ridiculous home run numbers. So last thing I wanted to bring up, and once again, it's the Fantasy Baseball Preview, Past Ball Show, brought to you by JohnPielli.com, St. Aloysius Church in Jackson, New Jersey. 2 ways, one passion food truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I wanted to give you some pluses and minuses when it came to some of the sleeper picks. And we go a little deeper into the sleeper picks and we think of top prospects. A lot of times we pull up the top prospect list and say, hey, after whatever the sleeper round is, I'm going to make sure I take this player. There's some players I think you should be interested in taking if they're available for sleepers. In fact, I think there's some players that are so good, you may want to take them before the sleeper round. Forget about keeping them next year. That player is going to help you this much on your team this year. And that first player is Randy Arozarena of the Tampa Bay Rays. You saw him in the World Series this past year. He still probably qualifies as a rookie. Or I don't know how many at-bats he got last year, but the bottom line is he's still prospect worthy. He's a guy that's going to hit for some power, certainly going to get a chance to play in Tampa Bay as they moved a couple of their players out like they do every offseason. And another player that I think you should think about is Ian Anderson, a pitcher of the Atlanta Braves. I might take Ian Anderson in the 5th or 6th round if he's available. Certainly in the 7th or 8th round. If he's available in the sleeper round and he's not the first player you're taking, you're going to miss out. Ian Anderson's going to be part of leading that Brave staff. Mike Soroka, who's coming off of an injury, those two pitchers are going to be just as integral as anybody else in the National League, let alone just for the Braves. So a couple other players I would say you could sleep on in regards to being impact players this year. I think one of the things we forget about when it comes to sleeper type of players, you want that player to perform well enough during the given season that they're in that they would naturally become a top pick in the next year's draft. You know, a player goes out there like a Fernando Tatis and has the year he had last year, he's certainly a first round type of talent. If you got him as a keeper, he counts as a late round draft pick, and you get that type of value for him. So I think Wander Franco from the Tampa Bay Rays is going to be playing every day for them, whether it's second base or shortstop. I think he's going to be their regular shortstop. The guy's got some ridiculous power. I would monitor the season that the Kansas City Royals have. I think they're looking to try to compete this year. They feel like they can steal some games for the Tigers and maybe the Indians, and maybe could be in a race to a point where they could make a couple September type of trade deadline moves to get themselves in a race for a wild card spot. I don't think that's going to happen. And if you're a fantasy baseball fan, you may want to hope that that doesn't happen, because that would mean that Bobby Witt Jr. is going to come up and play every day for the Royals at shortstop. And of course, Bobby Witt's father was the former Texas Rangers pitcher. Bobby Witt, the shortstop, is a hell of a hitter. Hit a 480-foot bomb in spring training. He's a guy that I think is going to come right up to the major leagues and hit. But I'd be careful. I wouldn't take him in the first sleeper round available. I'd try to get him a little later, because there's no guarantee he's going to be up and playing every day. And there's no guarantee that the Royals are going to quit on their season to just bring the younger players up and let them play. They got players that are up there that are supposed to fill spots, and it's very important that they, led by Dayton Moore, keep the image that they're really going to try to compete this year. Jared Kelenick's injury with the Seattle Mariners may impact his ability to start the season on the Mariners roster. Well, of course, if you talk about their former CEO who ended up getting fired for making stupid comments, he wasn't coming up opening day anyway. Jared Kelenick, of course, known for being in the Robinson Cano, Edwin Diaz trade, coming from the Mets to the Mariners, is going to be a good player. And depending on how the Mariners do this year, not only would I invest in Jared Kelenick as a sleeper pick, but I'd also take a flyer on Taylor Trammell. Taylor Trammell will probably come up at some point this year and get a chance to play every day. The Mariners have a dream outfield of Kelenick and Trammell and Julio Rodriguez. That's going to be the outfielder of the future. Who knows if it's going to be, Mays McCovey and Bobby Bonds. Time will tell. But I'd consider Trammell as a late round pick, as a guy that could come in there and play every day. Remember, they got Kyle Lewis, who won the Rookie of the Year award last year, playing center field. I think you could see something similar out of Taylor Trammell. Other players that I would consider, Key Brian Hayes for the Pittsburgh Pirates, Charlie Hayes' son. At some point, he's going to be playing every day for the Pirates, a team that's got nothing to play for. And if his player is as good as expected, he should put up really good numbers on a bad Pittsburgh team. Christian Pache may get a chance to be an everyday player for the Atlanta Braves. Would have, had there been a DH in the National League. Marcell Ozuna is going to be back. Nick Markakis is retiring. Ender Inciarte is more of a fourth outfielder. Of course, they got Acuna there. So Pache could get a chance to play every day in right field. Another player that, actually two pitchers, actually we'll go three pitchers that I think are going to be very valuable for you if you have a late round pick and want to scoop them up, would be Nate Pearson of Toronto, who I think is going right in their rotation. A Toronto team that's expected to go out there and compete for at least the wild card spot, maybe the division in the American League East. Sixto Sanchez, who we saw last year with the Miami Marlins. The Marlins are expected to be better. Even if they are the fifth best team in that National League East, they still should be able to win about 75 to 80 games. And Sixto Sanchez, by this season, should establish himself as one of the top pitchers on that staff. And the other guy is more of a sleeper. Let's say it's a 25-round draft, let's say it's a 22-round draft, your last pick of the draft, it might not be a bad investment to take Luis Patino from the Tampa Bay Rays. Patino came over in the Blake Snell trade and hasn't emerged very much in his time in San Diego. I don't know if Tampa Bay is going to use him as a starter or a reliever, but hey, the guy's going to get a lot of strikeouts either way. And he might be somebody that could very slowly and carefully and unexpectedly slide through the radar this year. If Tampa Bay is good, like we automatically expect them to be regardless of what players they have on their team, somebody's going to have to emerge. There's no more Blake Snell. There's no more Charlie Morton. Could Luis Patino be the guy? Big thanks for everybody for tuning in for this Passball Show. Once again, if you're following this video on YouTube, comment what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it, and a little bit of your fantasy baseball takes. Was I on to the things that I was talking about? Is there anything you feel like you could add that could help the listeners down the road? We'll be back with you next Thursday as we talk about everything going on in the world of baseball, sports, and unifying America. Hope you have a good week, good weekend. God bless you. And as always, I'll see you on the other side.